I was 17 the first time I saw hell with my own two eyes. It was just another normal morning on November 9th, 1888, but the air had an undeniable chill to it. My breeches were much too thin for the coldness which was beginning to wrap around the city, but I had to make do until my next salary. As I stepped outside of the small cottage I lived in on the other street and made my way onto the streets of Whitechapel, everything reeked of rain and rotting flesh. I had been working at the Star newspaper office for nearly 2 years now, delivering papers and sometimes helping set the morning type. The owner, Mr. Lancaster, trusted me enough now to allow me to open the shop in the morning, which was why I was always up the earliest and reached there the first. I quite enjoyed my busy routine and all the mornings I spent delivering newspapers to the nobility. But never could I have thought that waking up early would one day become part of the very horror I helped in printing. That was the morning when I accidentally stumbled upon the body of Mary Jane Kelly. I always took the route from the narrow alleyways to reach the newspaper office, putting me right across Miller's Court. Her tiny room was barely lit by the morning fog, but what I saw inside, I could only wish I hadn't. The very horror of her death was laid bare before me, and if I had not known that it was her room, I would have never been able to guess it was her. Her body was torn apart, making her face entirely unrecognizable. A scream lodged in my throat as I took slow, tentative steps toward the open door, my mind reeling with the horror of what I was witnessing. As I entered inside, I noticed how her insides were strewn across the bed like a sick butcher's display. Her face was skinned entirely, leaving nothing but bleeding flesh underneath. Everything in her once well-kept room was in disarray, giving signs of fighting back. She must have fought for her life, but she had failed. And I knew exactly who had done this to her. It could be no one else but Jack the Ripper. The crime scene had Jack the Ripper written all over it. I do not remember screaming, but despite that the whole street heard the horror in my voice. Within minutes, the faintly sleeping street had woken up, rushing towards Miller's Court. Several of the residents had gone to immediately summon the police while I stood there silently, frozen in spot. Mr. Lancaster has also shown up and asked me countless times to leave, not wanting someone with a young mind to witness such horror, but I was rotted to the spot. I did not know how I could get away from there after what I had already seen. Even if I left, the image of her torn body would stay stuck in my mind. I had already heard cases of how this was also done to other victims of Jack the Ripper, and the way he enjoyed dismembering bodies and removing all vital organs. How could one man be so sick did not make much sense to me, but now I had proof right before my eyes. He was a heartless, merciless killer. The police arrived not long after, pushing me away from the crime scene to investigate. I still did not want to leave. Something in me was attached to it, as if it was my horror to witness. Mr. Lancaster was still beside me when Mr. Albert Carrington, the local barber on the street, came to stand beside us, watching me tremble outside her door. His shop was just a few doors down from Mary's, and I often passed it on my way to the newspaper office. Albert was a rather quiet man and always dressed in black with his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. I had seen how his straight razor gleamed in his hand as he shaved the men of Whitechapel since everyone went to him. He was well liked and respected on the street, but something about him had forced me to watch him for weeks now. Something about him just triggered my conscience. It had started ever since the first letter from Jack the Ripper had arrived at our newspaper office a few months ago. No one else had looked at him, but for some reason, my eyes had only turned towards Mr. Carrington. The letter had been written in red ink, signed with, "Yours truly, Jack the Ripper," as if he thought it was important to give himself a name. I had been the first one to touch the letter and read those words before giving them away to Mr. Lancaster, who had published it and given it to relevant authorities. But despite that, the words were still fresh in my mind. "I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them." The letter had almost seemed like an open declaration to war, as if the killer was mocking the police or laughing at them for not being able to catch him. The moment I had read the letter, I had remembered Albert Carrington's handwriting, which I had only seen once, when he had signed the ledger for his weekly paper delivery. The curve of the letters and the sharp cut of the R was exactly the same. It felt as if I was reading Albert Carrington's writing all over again. And that scared me. But no one knew about my suspicions. Now that he stood beside me, calmly staring at the horrific scene before him, my doubts returned just the same. It was the way he looked at everything before him, with nothing but cold precision, as if it was normal for him to witness such things on a daily basis. He had no sorrow or grief in his eyes, and no guilt or remorse either. The only emotion in his eyes was one of supreme satisfaction, and it unsettled me deeply. "Are you all right, lad?" he asked, throwing a glance at me before looking up at Mr. Lancaster with a questioning look. "He was the one who found her. He's a little shaken," Mr. Lancaster replied on my behalf, saving me the trouble. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice raspy and cold. "Why don't you come with me, lad? It seems as if you are long overdue for a haircut anyway, and it will calm your jittering nerves." "I am fine," I replied, trying to sound as firm as possible. "I do not require a haircut, Mr. Carrington, but thank you for the offer." "You must go with him," Mr. Lancaster insisted. "I do not want you standing here any longer and forcing yourself to watch such hideous things, and your hair does seem excessively overgrown underneath your hat. Now go." I did not protest any longer, even though I didn't have a good feeling about this. Instead, I quietly walked behind him as he took me to his barber shop, which was completely empty at this time of the morning. Moreover, the entire street was preoccupied with the brutal murder, which had happened only a few doors away, and were certainly not thinking about getting a haircut. I do not really understand why I followed him, but it almost felt as if I was numb and simply following around. Or perhaps I needed answers to the doubts and accusations which were building up in my head, and there was no better time than this. The shop was dimly lit, filled with the scent of shaving cream and damp wood. It soothed me a little, but Mr. Carrington's presence was still not allowing me to relax. I sat down on the seat he pointed towards, the large looking glass in front of me displaying my pale and terrified face. Mr. Carrington expertly draped the barber's cape around my neck and stood behind me, his ice-cold hands brushing against my hair. It did not feel right. Something about his touch was extremely unsettling, as if those hands had been drawing out someone's organs only a few hours ago. I could not hold it in any longer, and knew I needed to say something. It was time. "It was you, wasn't it?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. But in the silence of the shop, Mr. Carrington heard me just fine. "Pardon?" he asked, his face turning into one of shock. I knew he understood exactly what I meant with that question, but was acting innocent for no reason. "You killed her. You killed all of them. You are Jack the Ripper. Are you not, Mr. Carrington?" I asked again, this time much bolder and rather loud. There was no doubt that he had heard me. His hand froze, the blade gleaming in his hands. The precision with which he was holding the blade in his hand only gave me even greater proof of his crimes. He seemed like an expert at cutting skins, and thus had been playing with people for quite a few months now. Chills ran down my spine as his face suddenly broke into a smile. I could see that I had been right. He leaned in closer to my ear and whispered dramatically, "Clever boy. You have known this for quite some time now, haven't you? I've been feeling some eyes on me, following my every move, but I just could not figure out who it was. Now I finally know this as well." It was him. There was no longer any doubt. This one statement of agreement was confession enough. My heart stopped. Suddenly I became a little too aware of the shining razor blade which was much too close to my neck. His smile was sinister, as if he had never felt guilt or remorse in his life and did not feel any of it now either. "I have had my doubts," I replied, my voice nothing more than a whisper. It would be understatement to say that I was terrified. "I believe it was you who first delivered my letters to your newspaper, wasn't it? I always wondered what it must feel like to you, to hold the words of a killer in your hands." I felt the edge of his straight razor brush against my neck, as if he was making a statement. The pressure increased ever so suddenly, a tiny drop of blood appearing over my white skin. I could not take the risk of gulping either, or his razor would pierce through skin easily. So you knew I had recognized you? I asked the moment he removed the razor and used his thumb to wipe away the tiny dot of blood. Another drop appeared back immediately, and he repeated the motion. I was almost certain, he nodded. I did consider killing you that day now that I was sure my secret might be revealed, but then I decided against it. I don't ever kill men. Never have. Never will. I couldn't breathe. But you killed all those women? I stuttered, still in shock. The man I had known and seen for such a long time was the cold-blooded murderer everyone had been looking for. He was the man behind such brutal killings that even the police was horrified. He was the reason that every woman in the city felt unsafe, and I had known about it for quite some time now. If I had taken an action sooner or had simply told the authorities about my suspicions, Mary Jane Kelly might have been alive today. I did, Mr. Carrington finally replied, continued to touch my hair. Mary, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, Polly. I gutted every single one of them. I killed them after torturing them, and then slowly cut them open to remove their organs from inside their bodies. It was slow work, but oddly satisfying and made me feel happy again. Do you know why I did it, lad? I shook my head, tears beginning to fall out of my eyes. Because women are wicked creatures and deserve to be punished. Especially these prostitutes who are selling their bodies when they should be hiding them, he reasoned manically, beginning to sound like the murderer he was. I stayed quiet, watching him cut my hair from the back. He was making slow work of it, as if he wanted me sitting on his chair for a much longer time than I wanted to be there for. But I stayed put. There was no reason to fight with him when I knew he was much stronger and could break his vow of now killing men in the matter of a second. He had already murdered countless women and was capable of extreme amounts of violence. I needed to be careful. Why are you silent, boy? Have nothing else to say? He probed, brushing my hair through his fingers. I had been so absorbed in my own thoughts that I hadn't even noticed that the haircut was completed. I stayed quiet while he combed my hair, keeping the straight razor back on the counter in front of me. He picked up his pair of scissors and made some final cuts before removing the cloth from around my neck. I stood up from the chair and brushed my clothes, trying to maintain as much distance as I possibly could with him. I should have run away then, without indulging in any more conversation, but I was much too horrified to do that. Every part of my body wished to make him pay for the crimes he had done, but I did not know what to do. Well, he asked when he saw me staring, and I knew he could see the strange anger in my gaze. I will tell everyone, I said softly, almost too quietly for him to hear. Pardon? He asked, laughing out loud. I will tell the police and the papers, and they will all know that it was you who killed those poor, innocent women. You deserve to go to jail and be punished for your crimes, Mr. Carrington, and I will make sure it happens, I shouted, the anger inside my body making me louder. I was still terrified of him, but I no longer cared. I knew exactly what I needed to do. To my surprise, he began to laugh. It was soft at first, but it steadily grew louder until it filled the entire room. Those women are neither innocent nor poor, little boy, he sighed. I am only doing the world a favor by killing them. That is what they deserve. No, they don't, I shouted back, my voice almost as loud as his now. But you do deserve to get punished for killing them, and I will make sure it happens. And who will believe you? He suddenly asked, his question making me pause. What do you mean? Everyone will believe me. You confessed the truth in front of me yourself, I reasoned, unsure of the words which were coming out of my mouth. I am Albert Carrington, boy, who is a humble barber working on this street for years now. Every shopkeeper and homeowner in this area knows me and loves me. I am respectable and old and a member of this society. The men of Whitechapel trust me with a razor blade to their throats every day, but you are just an orphan boy who is a street rat with no respect attached to his name. Who even knows you? They will still believe I am telling the truth, I replied, trying to instill confidence in my words, but I had lost all of it. No, they won't, he laughed again. They will only think that you have seen too much since you discovered the body of Mary Jane Kelly and were the first person to see her. They will think you are in shock and the trauma of such horror is causing you to lose your mind. They will never raise fingers at me, but will only sympathize with your sensitive condition. They will never believe you when you say that I apparently confessed in front of you. And if you don't believe me, you must run along now and tell everyone. If you dare, that is. You are wrong, I shouted again. You will see. I ran outside, making my way straight to the police, which were still outside Mary Jane Kelly's apartment. The crowd gathered there consisted of almost everyone in Whitechapel. When I came running through, panting and breathing loudly, the constables and officers turned to look at me. So did all the men of the area. My boss, Mr. Lancaster, and the other journalists in the street were also gathered there, everyone's eyes on the scene before them. You must all listen to me. I know who the murderer is, I shouted loudly, and everyone turned to look at me with interested eyes. Really, boy? Who is it? The police officer asked, walking ahead to the front of the group. Albert Carrington, the barber, I quickly said, gulping in air to steady my breath. The crowd looked at me uncomfortable, a few of them staring at me with sad gazes. The reaction was not one of shock and horror as I had thought it to be, but one where I could see that no one believed my word for it. It was evident. I tried to steady myself, but the footsteps behind me told me that he had arrived on the scene as well. Unlike me, he was still calm and collected. Why are you accusing the old barber of such a heinous crime, boy? Are you out of your mind? The officer asked, chuckling softly. I could see he didn't believe me. He confessed it to me himself. He told me how he was the one who gutted Mary Jane Kelly and all the other women before her. He agreed to it himself, sir. You must arrest him at once, I went on, turning to glance at Mr. Carrington, who was still silent. Is that so? The officer asked me, turning his gaze towards the barber. What is he talking about, Mr. Carrington? I wish I could understand it myself, sir, Mr. Carrington replied, staring at me sympathetically. He was standing there trembling outside the horrific scene of Miss Mary's death, and I simply took him away to give him a haircut so I could help calm him nerves. But in the middle of the haircut, he began to make up these elaborate stories and began to accuse me of murdering Miss Mary and all the other young women. I believe the boy is in extreme stress and trauma and does not know what he is saying or thinking. Mr. Carrington is right, sir, Mr. Lancaster jumped in, keeping a firm hand on my shoulder as if trying to steady me. He did reach at the scene first and called everyone. I think he is simply stressed at what he saw and is coming up to conclusions without thinking them through. He is very young after all and cannot comprehend all this. He needs rest. I believe he is in shock. I am not in shock, I shouted, staring at Mr. Lancaster with pleading eyes. I promise that I am not lying, Mr. Lancaster, sir. Mr. Carrington confessed to the crimes in front of me just minutes ago, and now he is denying it all because he does not wish to get arrested. He is simply trying to fool you all, I promise. If he was indeed the murderer, boy, why would he confess in front of you or anyone? The officer asked. Your employer is right. You are in shock and need rest, or you will go on accusing respectable and innocent men all over the street. Why don't you run off over to your place and sleep for a while? I am not lying, officer, I replied, but I already knew all my efforts were fruitless. No one was going to believe me, just like Mr. Carrington had predicted in his shop. I think he just does not need rest, but also needs a doctor. Someone my wife knew suffered a similar fate after going through trauma. We sent him to a doctor in the country where he could get proper care and rest under supervision, and that helped him. He is a changed man now, a man from the crowd suddenly chimed in, walking forward. I do not need a doctor, I replied, trying not to lose myself in anger. I simply need for you all to believe me and arrest this man. There will only be more deaths otherwise, and you will all be to blame. I kept trying to convince them, but Albert had been right. No one even thought of suspecting the quiet, well-mannered barber who was always there for everyone. Everyone simply thought that I had been losing my mind because of the scene I saw in the morning. They all collectively decided to send me away to Dr. Elliott's clinic for treatment, which was nothing but a luxurious jail in the countryside where they kept me locked away. I was constantly tormented by the faces of the women he had slaughtered, and kept wondering if he could be killing others while I was here. I was sure he would have only continued with his killing spree, now having the faith of all of society in him. Once Dr. Elliot was convinced that I was doing all right again, he sent me back. When I returned, to my surprise, Albert's barber shop was completely empty. He had left. Mr. Lancaster immediately rehired me and told me that after the day of the accusation and Marjane Kelly's murder, Mr. Carrington suddenly disappeared. He vanished like smoke in the London fog and no one was able to find him. The authorities found this strange and wondered if I had been right about my suspicions, and if Mr. Carrington could actually be the killer. They tried to find him, but it was too late. It almost felt as if he had never even existed. After that, I never saw Albert Carrington again. There were no murders after that of Mary Kelly, and the world moved on. The police chalked the murders up to a madman who had disappeared in the shadows, but I knew they did wonder if they should have believed me. If only they had arrested Albert Carrington before he had run away, all those poor women would have found justice. But the police had failed them. The only person who knew the complete truth was me. I still keep wondering how differently things would have turned out, if only they had believed me, but no one ever would. I knew what I had seen, and I had heard his confession. But what was most terrifying was how I had seen his evil, murderous smile through the looking-glass, with the barber's razor shining in his hands. I will forever be the only person who had heard Jack the Ripper confess, even when I had no desire to be that person.